Craig Coker. I'm the university chaplain here at the University of Richmond, and on behalf of my colleagues in the Jepson School of Leadership Studies in the Department of Religion, I want to welcome you to this conversation about money enough with Professor Doug Hicks. The mission of the chaplaincy is to inspire generous faith and to engage the heart of the university. And one of the ways that we seek to do this is to animate conversations of meaning that cultivate our highest ideals of responsible living. Professor Hicks' book, Money Enough, Everyday Practices for Living Faithfully in the Global Economy, is intended to animate meaningful conversations around money, how we relate to it, what it should be used for, how it should form and shape our lives. It is written for clergy and lay people, for Christians trying to go more deeply into their own tradition, and for those of other traditions and people of goodwill who are wrestling with the complex role that money plays in our individual lives and our wider society, especially at a time that is filled with so much economic anxiety. Doug Hicks has degrees from Davidson, Duke, and Harvard. Try it easier school. Davidson, Duke, and Harvard is a Presbyterian minister. He teaches in leadership studies and religion here at UR and works across disciplines of ethics, economics, and theology. He is also the author of With God on All Sides, Leadership in a Devout and Diverse America. Doug is going to speak for about 25 minutes or so, and then we'll have about another 20 minutes of question and answer afterwards. After that, we'll aim to wrap up at about 12 o'clock. If anyone is interested in having lunch with Doug and I are going to continue the conversation over lunch at our dining center. This is like the best campus food you've ever had nearby. It's very inexpensive. If you're interested in that, just meet in the back after the program, and we'll walk over to the dining hall together. There are copies of Doug's book in the back that you can buy, and perhaps he'll sign them for you afterwards. And if you are looking for study guides in which to work with small groups on this, you can find a free study guide at practicingourfaith.org. I want to thank Shannon Best and Sue Robinson in the Jepson School for helping to pull all of this together, and for all of you, pastors and professors, lay people, students, and other people of merely curious to be as part of this conversation today. Thank you, and welcome to the University of Richmond. And now I want to welcome Dr. Doug Hicks, who will speak to us. Doug.
So I hope today we can reflect that sense of conversation, and one way we could not do that is if I talked for the entire time, or even worse, if I read some document. So I will try to make comments for about 25 minutes, present an overview of what I think the conversation could look like, and then I look forward to your comments and conversation. I want to mention, as Craig did, the study guide that's free online. We're trying to bolster group study with the book, whether it's community, a church, study group, a Bible study, a leadership group, whatever. And I want to acknowledge my friend and colleague, Robert Johnson, who's here. He is the lead author on that study guide, and I'm the second author. But we hope that that study guide is also of use, and you can't beat the price. It's free. So how much is enough? That's really the presenting question that I try to look at in the book. I hope we can look at today. How much do I need to earn or own in order to be happy? It turns out that we're pretty inefficient at converting money into happiness. And also that we think that money has a fuller part in creating happiness than it actually does. So we are more hopeful about what money will do for us than what it actually does. How much is enough? How much do I need to save to be able to retire? Well, that's a lively question, and it's also a moving target as people think about retirements and watch the stock market if they're fortunate enough to have a 401k, and also to think about what it means to stop working, to stop providing for oneself and for others, and hope that their money can provide for them, or perhaps others will need to if the money runs out. How much should I give? How much should I give to church, or to the United Way, or to Haiti? That latter question is so overwhelming and it's even humbling because I think that there's no way that we could possibly give enough. No way when we look at people surviving without a home, without a dollar a day of income, how much would be enough to meet those needs or to be a global neighbor to folks like that? Or even this weekend, the disaster in Chile. Of course, had better infrastructure than Haiti. Was looking at 500,000 homes that are damaged beyond repair, numbers that are staggering. So these kind of presenting disasters really shift our discussion of what survival is. We talk a lot about economic survival and economic recession, but how those conversations are relativized and shifted when we're talking about actual survival. Survival for trying to make it through the night or through the week or until a tent comes or until supplies arrive. But so also do the more mundane realities, everyday realities, relativize our discussions of economic survival. I'm talking about the context of the global economy, where the best estimates by the World Bank place 1.4 billion people in absolute poverty, over 20% of the world's population. It's almost too much to get our minds around 1.4 billion people who earn less than $1.25 a day, or $450 a year. Well, some might say, well, bread's cheaper in Bolivia or Zimbabwe than it is here. Well, it is, but these are purchasing power adjusted dollars. They're supposed to account for the differences in purchasing power. And the electronics, the computers, the air conditioning that we use don't cost less in the other countries. $450 only goes so far, whatever you do. Or 40% of the world living under $2 a day, $730 a year. It's almost too much to get our minds around. We could talk about how much is enough, not in terms of income, literally, but in terms of nutrition and health. How much is enough to be well nourished? Well, recent economic recession globally has pushed the number of malnourished people around the world above 1 billion people. People celebrated in the developed world that the number of hungry or malnourished folks had come under 1 billion, but the recent recession has pushed it back up. But one of the reasons I chose the title for this book, Money Enough, is that there actually are calories enough in the world for everyone to live nutritious, healthy, decent lives. The best estimates by the FAO and others is that there are 2,800 kilocalories a day per person in the world today that are available if they were distributed efficiently and equally. So we have not just a problem of scarcity, we have a problem of distribution. We have a problem of political and spiritual will, a problem of imagination, and a problem of priorities as we think about providing enough for every human being in the world. So that shifts our discussion of economic survival, of what money enough really is. So I think of it in terms of the feeding of the 6.5 billion. It's actually 6.7 billion because the book took a year to come out. And the population is headed up. And I compare that with the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 in an isolated mountainous area, I think today of the areas of Chile that are isolated and without supplies of food. But in this case, the story that appears in all four Gospels, so we're supposed to know that it's an important story in the Christian narrative. 5,000 men and then other women and children around without enough to eat. They followed Jesus, but without bringing enough food for everyone. Was that, and yet a little boy provides 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and says, let's share this, it should go around. For me, the interesting question today is, was that a supernatural miracle, the feeding of those thousands, or was it a social miracle? Maybe it was both. Maybe it doesn't matter. But it's a different nuance if you think of the fact that maybe people had some bread in their backpacks. Maybe they had some dried fish that they were hoarding for their family to make sure they had enough. Is it possible that back to that little boy or the leaders in the group, particularly Jesus saying, let's share, is it possible that people pulled out a lot of food and were able to share that to provide enough for others? It's at least an image that I like to think of as we think about providing money enough across boundaries and across the population. There are resources enough for everyone in the world today if we were to allocate them efficiently and equitably. So economics, what is it? It's the allocation of scarce goods to competing uses. That's what my friends in Economics 101 will teach you. It's the allocation of scarce goods to competing uses. So this land out here, are we going to use it to build a church, or an affordable housing unit, or a store, or a community garden, or perhaps a parking lot? We can only use that land for one thing. Or your time, should you use your available time to work more hours, or to spend it with family and friends? Those are finite resources that have to be allocated. And there is a question of scarcity that economics helps us to analyze, to talk about efficiency. But economics is also something else, and I learned this from my economics professor at Davidson College, my professor Charles Ratliff. Economics, taken etymologically, is the combination of the words oikos and nomos, or management or law of the household. How do we manage our finances together as a household? That's what economics is about. Now that can be taken literally at the domestic or personal level. How do we share within our household, within our family, within our circle of friends? But it also can expand, with the word oikos coming also to the ecology, and so forth, to the whole world. How do we share in God's creation? How do we think about managing the entire global economy, the global household? And from there, it's pretty easy to think about all human beings as created in the image of God, possessing human dignity and being worthy of the basic economic and other resources to live decent lives. That connects also to the word stewardship, which goes back to the words sty and warden, that we are keepers of the sty. Now, I didn't hear that word since my mother used to ask me about cleaning my room and saying, that's a sty in there. You need to keep it and take care of it. Stewardship means being keepers of the sty. It's a humbling way to put it, but we are protectors of the environment and of fellow global neighbors. How do we think about that? So we can think about economics as scarcity, and we can also think about it as managing a household where there are so many resources, and there is enough to go around if we think about sharing. So I have one story indelibly etched in my mind. It's the kind of story that I include in the book, and it may mean more to me than it does to you. That's what my wife said, that I tell the story too much. But she's not here, so I'll tell it. So I was a high schooler on a youth group trip going from 2nd Presbyterian Indianapolis to the Yucatan of Mexico. We were a group of privileged high schoolers from Indiana who thought we had a lot to offer by building a house and painting a church in the Yucatan. And we didn't realize, of course, it would take too much time to compute that labor was available in the Yucatan for about $1 a day. So it doesn't make sense to go on mission trips for any economic reasons when you could send money to do the labor and to purchase labor locally, but we weren't thinking of that. My friend Jay and I were walking through the local market one day, and he wanted to buy a beautiful hand-woven Mexican rug. I don't remember the exact numbers, but the conversation went something like this. He said, how much for the rug? And the merchant said, 100 pesos. And Jay said, I'll give you 20. And the merchant said, how about 50? Jay said, I'll give you 20. The merchant said, how about 30? Jay said, 20. So the merchant, exasperated, handed Jay the rug, put it in his hand, and said, okay, 20. I thought we were done. This was going to be a nice transaction at some market clearing price, at least in that context, until my friend Jay said, "I'll give you 15. Now that's a little bit embarrassing, cultural awkwardness, certain norms have been broken, all kinds of issues there in terms of keeping one's word and trust among these two buyers and sellers. So we got out of there with our lives, and Jay got out with a rug at 20. But for me, that raised some real questions that I think open up into the conversation today. First, the global market is usually a set of impersonal transactions. Some of us know who our baker is, but most of us buy our bread at the grocery store and have no idea where it was made. My friend Jonathan White in economics does an exercise in his Econ 101 course where he has students the first day read each other's tags on their clothing so they can talk to each other and ask, where was your clothing made? The thing even there, it might say made in the U.S., but that probably means it was assembled in the United States, but made around the world, and the pieces were just sewn together in the United States. We don't know where our products come from. The global market is so impersonal that we can easily feel ineffective, that we're price takers, that we're market takers, that we have little influence. But here was a moment where the market was very personal. The interactions were one-on-one, human, face-to-face. So then, the next point that this story opens up for me is that those relationships, those one-on-one exchanges, or the impersonal ones that we don't see, they can be either healthy forms of human interaction or they can be unhealthy. They can in fact be degrading, not just to one side of the transaction, but to both. If you're exchanging, say, prostitution, it's a degrading act for both sides of the exchange. Or you can imagine cases where you buy products that were made with slave labor or child labor. Then those acts are degrading to the seller, not to the buyer, and so forth. So next, we need justice to govern our exchanges. We need justice to govern them. What would be a fair exchange? What was a fair exchange in this case? In Mexico, where there's not a clear market, there wasn't perfect information, at least for the buyers, to know what the market clearing price was. How do we think about what it means to have a voluntary exchange, where people come openly on both sides to transact in the market? Who has the power in these transactions, and does it matter? And then finally, probably the most important point is one of moral agency, of the power to have decisions and have them make a difference. So my friend Jay, in this case, had power to actually shape a reality by how much he paid for that rug. Most often we feel like we have no power in the market. We don't know who we bought it from, we don't know where we're going, and we just try to get the best deal that we can. But we don't think that our actions ripple out there into the world. So the book, I hope, is a set of reflections, set of practical reflections on what money's role should be in a well-lived life, with the assumption that our actions do ripple out there, that the conversations we have together have effects on those who are near us, in terms of shaping their behavior, and also that our economic influence through our buying and selling, investing, saving, and giving have ripple effects. Economists tell us that anyway, have ripple effects far beyond what we can imagine or know. But we live in a society where the assumption is we're trying to maximize our wealth or maximize our income in a flow concept, in a year-to-year concept. There's the assumption that money leads to success. Well, there's a lot of good data that money has less impact on our sense of happiness after the fact than before the fact. That we're always going to want 20 to 25% more than we have, that our desires outpace our abilities to catch up with them through our work or through our economic smarts, our earning power. I want us to shift our vision from seeing money as an end-all and be-all to seeing money as an important means toward ends that do matter. And here I borrow from the economist with whom I was fortunate to study, Amartya Sen, the Indian-born economist at Harvard who has worked on development economics and poverty and inequality. He's developed an approach called the capabilities approach. I see one of the Justice and Civil Society courses has made it. Thank you, Dr. Williamson. And I bet you at some point will talk about the capabilities approach as one form of justice, one approach to justice. So we talk about what capabilities are necessary to live a well-lived, a flourishing life. Not having a lot of money in your checking account. That's a means to other ends. The ends we're talking about are things like these: being in good health, having a good education, having friends and loved ones around you, being a political and cultural participant, being able to appear in public without shame, as Adam Smith put it so colorfully, being able to worship and enjoy religious freedom and other forms of expression in our society. These are what are building blocks for a good and decent life. Money is an important means to these, but it can't buy any of these directly. You can pay tuition at the University of Richmond or at Union PSCD or at VCU, but that doesn't buy you an education. You still have to do the work, still have to engage. And that's one of the more direct uses of money. The others are less direct altogether. So faith and money. What does faith have to do with this conversation? Well, in one way of putting it, it has everything to do with it. There are two easy answers in the Christian tradition to faith and money. I think they're the wrong answers. I think they're too easy for us. But they're so compelling, they're so inviting in the stories that they tell. The first is the prosperity gospel. It's the idea that if you are faithful, God will bless you. And God will bless you particularly with riches, economic riches. The flip side of that, of course, is that if you are in poverty, then you must have done something wrong. Perhaps you have been sinful. You have not been faithful in use of your money. And so you are responsible for your actions and for your conditions. Now, this is a pretty prevalent perspective. It comes in different notes and different keys. But we see the prosperity gospel all around us. We see it in the paperback bestseller, Jesus CEO. How would Jesus be the executive? We see it in a recent media inquiry that I received from someone wanting to suggest that God wants Christians to be millionaires. Could I offer a comment to help buttress that perspective? I could not. It's the view that capitalism is God's preferred mechanism to allow for human freedom. That view doesn't go further to say, well, which capitalism, which products, which market, what would that market look like? It assumes that humans have very little agency if we just say that capitalism promotes freedom, which is God's will for humans, therefore it's good. That really begs the question. Now there's another approach, and it also has a number of notes and keys, but it's the approach that says the market is evil. That we are somehow purer or better if we avoid the market. Turn off your TV, just don't read those catalogs, don't have credit cards, and just opt out of the market. Now there's much that's appealing about this. It captures the idea that we have individuals have agency, that we can shape our economic lives. But it's also an individual solution to what's a collective or systemic problem of economic justice. It may make us feel better, but it doesn't do anything about the needs out beyond ourselves. And besides, I'm not sure I've met someone who actually has opted out of the market. People might opt out of one aspect, but then they engage in others. This is actually a commodity. It's a commodity I hope you will enjoy purchasing. But we're not opting out of the market by coming together to talk about this. On the contrary, we're trying to say, how should we engage the market? As people with agency and as a collective, as sets of communities who can really shape the market in important ways, how are we going to engage it? That's very different than saying the market is evil and I'm going to opt out of it. And in fact, a friend of mine colorfully put this distinction, this challenge of steering somehow between the two approaches, the prosperity gospel and the opt-out approach. She said, I'm not willing or even able to make my own clothes, but I think I can do better than still drive my SUV and just be a little nicer to people at Starbucks. I think we can do better than that as well. The kind of the depth of conversation goes beyond actions. So I want to talk about a few economic practices, a few things that we can do every day that help us connect from our own personal economic lives towards the global economy. That's the challenge of writing this book, and I think it's the challenge of living lives in an economy where we feel so overwhelmed by the messages, and to have a sense that we can make so little difference. How do we connect our own everyday practices to the wider economic world? Well, first, we should take stock of our own economic practices. We should ask the question of what survival means for us, and then to go beyond that to say, well, what would it mean to flourish? What kind of life am I hoping to live? So our study guide has exercises related to, and this is hard for an academic to actually be practical, so I hope you appreciate the struggle with this. We included inventories that have to do with how we spend our time, with what our bank accounts look like and what our expenditures and also our incomes look like, and even what's in our closets. What do we need and what is of excess? And then the next practice is to talk about shaping our values. I can't help but raise the issue of how our values should align with our practices, but they don't always. Whether we're talking about the live Earth concerts that were shown around the world a few years ago, and the discussion was don't use the plastic water bottles. I'm really glad there isn't one up here today. Don't use the plastic water bottles because they're so wasteful to the environment. And then they went to the next musical act, and they had the plastic water bottles lined up across the stage. Or the $25,000 pen that the Mont Blanc pen company brought out a couple of years ago in honor of Mahatma Gandhi. That's one that shows we all live in certain tensions, certain hypocrisies. If you're in this room, we are rich. We are rich in global standards. And now some of us are richer than others, but we all have far more than our fair share. When you look at the global income distribution, and the average income annually is under $2,000 a year. You do your own account. So we all have to live with these tensions, to live in the market, but be aware of how our actions can shape a more just world. So, do our values align with our practices? What are ultimate values, to use the language of H. Richard Niebuhr? And what values are penultimate? And how do we line up those penultimate or less important values with the ultimate value? Whether that value is framed by, say, the Westminster Catechism, what is the chief end of man? To glorify God and enjoy God forever. Or if you have a different center of value, how do you align the penultimate or less important values with that ultimate center that guides your perspective? So once we've done that valuing exercise, then how do we go on to distinguish wants from needs? What does it mean to discern our desires? Desires are part of a fitting and healthy, flourishing life, but not the uncritical acceptance of all of our desires. So in the economic sphere, how do we distinguish our wants from our needs? How do we become aware of the messages that we're receiving from consumerism, from a market culture that is wanting to sell us stuff? College students, you are the target audience. You're young, you're upwardly mobile, you're 18 to 45 for the most part, and people want to sell you stuff. They want you to become part of their narrative. Well, how do we all become aware of those things? Not to pretend that we can escape them, but to try to put on filters that help us see the messages that we want to adhere to, that we want to follow, and which ones are unhealthy. My favorite billboard is right here in Richmond. I don't know if it's still there, but it was out in Short Pump, trying to sell apartments near the mall, and the sign said, "Live where you shop." Live where you shop. There's something backwards about that. I'm not sure what it is, but I hope we can talk about that. Compare that with the author of Isaiah, who writes, "Why do you spend your money on that which is not bread?" Why do we spend our money on those things that do not truly satisfy? That's a theological question, it's a moral question, it's an economic question. Then we should go on and ask what are our roles and responsibilities in our current family, household condition. I talk about providence, the idea that God will provide for us, which John Calvin intended as a doctrine of comfort for the people of Geneva and beyond. How do you put that hopeful, comforting doctrine, theological doctrine, in line with those 1.4 billion fellow humans who don't have enough even to survive absolute poverty? I think we do so with humility. We do so thinking about the ways that we can provide for ever-increasing circles beyond us. I write about my dad's generation of people who grew up in the Great Depression and who had such a hard time retiring or refused to retire because of the pressures imposed on them to provide. The sense of meaning that comes from life through working, by providing income for those around them. My hope for those folks, some of whom are dear to me, is to release that pressure on themselves and to let others help provide for them as well. The language of breadwinning, of course, is a very gendered discussion, and it's a very interesting discussion about how certain people, particularly the male husband, father figure in households, had the pressure to provide for the family. In fact, those were biblically, that perspective was biblically based and biblically justified in ways that were unhealthy in my understanding for both the fathers and the mothers and everyone in those relationships, where one was the provider, the other was the homemaker. The beautiful way parts of that for some people. But we're now in a more egalitarian time where the language and the pressure to provide is on both men and women, and the pressures of time to balance family and community and work are on everyone. So how do we balance the working and the recreating? How do we think about that as more than just an economic exercise? Vocation, not vacation. Vocation is an old-fashioned word. It's a theological word that I think has a tremendous amount of power. To what are we called? And of course, the other question is, who is doing the calling? Vocation implies in the Christian tradition that God is calling us to certain ways of being in the world, not just by earning a wage at some job, but a vocation for all of life. How do we balance that with recreation, or fit recreation within that sense of vocation? These are real challenges, especially when our leisure time or our opportunities for recreation have also been captured by market language. So recreation is actually vacation, and we've now talked about power vacations. How do we recreate and recharge as efficiently as possible? How do we get as far away as possible on spring break and spend as much money as possible to really have a good time? Work hard, play hard is how the undergraduates put it, but we all live that to some extent. Vacation implies leaving our everyday reality to somehow get away from it all, as opposed to recreation, which requires more everyday practices that may not allow us to get to Tahiti or Cancun, but allow us to recreate in our own space, in our own routines. And that's even harder to do. Please turn off your cell phone pagers and text messages. I forgot to say that earlier, but you know what I'm saying. So then how do we expand our thinking from our own narrow circles towards that global ethic, towards all of creation? Global citizenship seems so abstract, so far from our everyday realities. How do we move from thinking of obligations beyond family, beyond our own circle, out towards, and beyond the nation state, towards that more global level? So we could think of examples of celebrities like Bono, who talk about taking the American dream out to become the African dream, the Palestinian dream, the European dream. We can draw on the Christian tradition to look at the Good Samaritan in a global context. So my friend Mark Blair and I edited a volume recently called Global Neighbors, doing exactly that, taking this Good Samaritan image out to look at global neighbors. People, the ones to whom we have duties in a global economy are not just those with whom we do business in the local market. We live in a global economy, we have global moral obligations. How do we do that? And so then we need to talk about justice. Justice at various levels, from the commutative justice, the justice of the exchange, to wider levels of distributive and social justice. So commutative justice allows us to ask in all of our everyday transactions, is this a voluntary exchange? What labor went into the product that I'm about to purchase, or that I'm about to sell? How can I use the technology around to have an idea of where this product came from, what source of labor were used, what the implications, the health implications of this product are, and so forth. We need to use the same technologies that have powered the global market to also be adept global consumers who understand what products we're buying. The Students Against Sweatshops a few years ago on college campuses used the power of the purse, the power of students who buy t-shirts like that lovely Richmond sweatshirt that says Richmond across it, at places like Michigan and Chapel Hill to say, who makes our sweatshirts? How do we guarantee that children aren't making these sweatshirts that we wear? And they've had some impacts on Nike and others who have changed their contracts and who now guarantee sweat-free products that they sell under those logos, those university logos. There are other ways that consumers can use their power, and also sellers can use their power with consumers to make sure that we have just transactions. There's a long tradition of commutative or exchange justice that even good free market capitalists should understand and appreciate. There's a lot of work to be done there in the global economy. Distributive justice talks about outcomes in important ways and opportunities. How do we share the resources of God's creation with everyone in ways that people would understand to generally be fair? So last week in my justice class, we looked at John Rawls and the experiment of being behind the veil of ignorance in the original position. Would people without their interests attached, without their gender or their class, their bank accounts attached, would they generally say that this arrangement is fair? How do we think about distributive justice? In the Christian tradition, there's a teaching or a doctrine called the preferential option for the poor. Are economic arrangements such that those who are poor have an advantage, have an opportunity to escape that poverty, because God wills poverty for no one? The economist Rebecca Blank, who is now the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs in the Department of Commerce, is a committed Christian who's written extensively on economic obligation and on distributive justice. She says that in earlier days with simpler economies, the duty to neighbor, to love one's neighbor as oneself, may well have easily been met through personal charity, through giving, through caring. But in a global and personal economy, the Christian obligation to love one's neighbor must use institutional mechanisms. In other words, doing justice through government policy is a part of the Christian obligation to love one's neighbor. Well, that's a pretty interesting point. It certainly isn't what the Tea Party folks have been saying about what the government's role is in redistribution, but it should be part of the conversation. What mechanisms should we have so that people have opportunities to flourish, but that everyone has those opportunities? And then finally, social justice. How do we provide opportunities for people to contribute to society? So the hot topic here is microcredit or microfinance. The Grameen Bank, Kiva, Oiko credit that make credit available to the poorest in the world, loans of $20 or $200 to people. How do we extend that credit to people who, when they pool their resources, can hold each other accountable and have incredible repayment rates? How do we think about that in our everyday lives in Richmond and elsewhere? What would it mean to extend credit or to provide opportunities to everyone? I even write about my friend Rick Mays and Jennifer Mays here at the University of Richmond, who started their own small microcredit organization in Cusco, Peru, based on their experience living there last year on sabbatical. They continue this Cusco Gracias to make it possible for people here in Richmond who are connected with Rick and Jennifer Mays to extend loans to folks in Peru. And that helps them. There are good communication channels that are opened up through these $20 loans and their repayment. So we're talking about money enough to live decent, sufficient lives. This isn't an income maximization exercise. It's about money enough to eat nutritiously, to live in good health. It's about money enough to educate our children and to participate in the life of our societies. It's about shifting the conversation from, do I have money enough, to, do we have money enough? Do we have money enough as we expand our communities outwardly? I'm the first to admit that talking about global obligations it's an abstract concept, but it's something we're called to do. We are global consumers, and we're also global neighbors. So I hope the conversation has started. I've left nearly the 20 minutes that we promised for conversation. I hope that kicks off the conversation. I think Craig was going to help us to have you give your input, and I thank you for your ideas and for struggling with me on mine. Thanks.
Was this thing on?
Test one. There it is. Terrific. Doug, thank you. Let's take some questions. I'll try to share this. So if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll come to you and be sure that you have the mic so everybody can hear you. Any questions?
As I understand what you're saying, an important facet is for people to feel part of a community, whether that be something close beyond your family, your church, your city, your country, or the world. And the bigger that community is, the more difficult I think it is for people to really understand how they can contribute to that. And if you want to really think about, do I have money enough, you have to really think about, what can I do with my excess to help my community? So I guess my question is, and I don't think there's a good answer, but I'll give you a shot at it. How do you identify with a community? How do you build community?
How do you build community? How do you identify with it? I think it has to start with personal relation. So when even in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, challenging the Corinthians to help the Macedonians, they should be joyful givers. They should give from their abundance so that others would have their needs met. There's a connection that Paul gives about knowing the Macedonians and how faithful and involved they've been. So for me, that's a good analogy of starting with people we know and using the networks of which we're a part. And one of the interesting questions here for me is how to use social networking. How to use these new technologies, which I dabble in but feel totally overwhelmed by, and look to people younger than me to help me out. What function can social networks have beyond our immediate circles of people we see and know every day? I think they're best thought of as a supplement to and not a replacement for interpersonal face-to-face reaction. But I use that example of Rick and Jennifer in Peru as a way of saying they're nodes in this network. They are bridge figures, to mix my metaphors. They are bridge figures that make it possible for me to support a taxista, a taxi driver in Cusco because of the connections they have. I'll bet if we took the time today to draw our own networks, that we would cover 50 or more countries, that you all would have actual personal friends in 50 or more countries in this circle. And so one way is to think creatively about those, making the abstract folks real. But Adam Smith had a famous example of earthquake victims halfway around the world, and how we might feel sympathy and we might feel sad for people who had hundred millions, he said, who died from an earthquake. But we might sleep well that night because we don't really have a personal attachment to them. But for ourselves and for others whom we have personal attachments, it's much easier to have those obligations. So for me, the question just returns as a question. How do we form those personal connections around the world? Another way is to look at the immigrant communities in Richmond and see, as we do in, say, justice and civil society, through refugee and immigration, services and elsewhere. The world is in Richmond, so we're 1 degree separated from those countries. As a student of mine in the back is a dual citizen in India, and I was traveling on one day about Kerala in this southern Indian district that has done so well being efficient with their resources in terms of life expectancy. And she said, actually my family's from Kerala. Caught me off guard, but it's really powerful to think of those ways, especially those of us who are economically privileged, to think about the actual connections we have.
Thank you, Doug. One of the more interesting, I think important to me books I've read, goes back a bit, it's called A Just Society, Fundamental Delusion. And it's a piece of social psychology, and I think it's irrefutable in its method. And what the author argues is that the way we escape the weight of our guilt, whether we're a surgeon in a hospital, people die, or whatever it might be, is we really at core do not believe that society is just, and therefore we blame the victim. When you start to think about the challenges of what you're talking about, there's kind of a somber note underneath it that we have to overcome. Part of what's going on is we have to overcome that huge gap between what we really believe is fair or just and what our guts kind of tell us is okay, they're getting it because they deserve it.
Thanks, Henry. It's a really important question. How do we get from where we are and the realities of injustice and severe inequalities that are just almost beyond comprehension to some ideal state, to some ideal justice? And I think Reinhold Niebuhr had one answer, which is the best we can do is have rough approximations to get to that, partly because of the power of human hubris, of self-interest, understood that way within each of us. And so that's a powerful note to realize that we're not going to get all the way there. But I find Richard Niebuhr more compelling in terms of the stories he tells of communities of meaning and purpose that are possible with real live human beings in the here and now. Never thinking that we can be God or to bring God's kingdom on to earth through our own actions. But there's a lot that can be done. One of the things that's powerful about the capabilities approach that Amartya Sen has laid out, and I borrow and appropriate for this thing about money and up, is that he is hard-edged, world-class economist who shows how we can think about things like efficiency and distribution, not in terms of money, but in terms of things that matter more, the capabilities. So we can talk about efficiency, equity trade-offs, not in terms of income, but in terms of, say, nutrition or health. So it's not losing this edge of efficiency that economists and economic tools provide for us so well about saying if you've only got so many widgets, how do you distribute them as efficiently as possible? But it is a shift of the currency in that discussion. So I don't think it's easy for Christian ethics in particular, and ethics more broadly, to sound pretty naive when it comes to talking about economic issues. Maybe we just don't understand self-interest. Maybe we just don't understand the human person and so forth. Maybe that's true. It is a hopeful vision, but I don't think it's naive. We can be very hard-edged in terms of shifting the discussions about efficiency, about distributing aid efficiently, and saying no to organizations that are corrupt or not getting the money to where it needs to go. So that doesn't get at your question fully, but it does say that the concept of justice is valuable even if we never fully attain it. Thank you for a very reasoned discussion. I've reflected here that where I see political action taking place or faith commitments being enlarged in terms of populations, it's either authority or power or passion that seems to be making a difference instead of reason. And so I guess I want to ask, are there issues related to this that you just really feel passionate about? And if you were passionate, would that interfere with your communication?
I feel passionate about a lot of this stuff, but I'm also trying to create a conversation that is reasonable. I don't think that, there's a great classic discussion about passion or reason in terms of our moral obligations, and whether, the dangers of passion are that we end up being connected to those we like more than those we dislike. And we end up looking locally because we're more passionate with those who are near us than those who are far. The critique of reason is that it's so cerebral, it doesn't have the motivation that compels us in to actually care. So, well, that sounds like a very nice reason, this rational discussion, but at the end we don't go home and make a difference. So we need passion and reason to work together. I can't help but tell a story that Martha Nussbaum tells about the Greeks who had a view about the Stoics, and they seem rather uninteresting. They were cosmopolitans, but they seemed so cerebral. But she tells the story of the two who would go. It says they would go to dinner parties naked and copulate in public. And she said she told the story to say that reasonable people don't have to lack passion. And so you can make of that as you will. But we need passion and reason. The stories coming out of Haiti for 3 weeks on CNN through Anderson Cooper and the important work that he did there were moving to tears. And I hope that it helped move people to give and to think even more so about long-term development strategies that were reasonable. But now my question is, what did that passion, that conversion moment, that the revival moment have? What enduring effect will that have if we don't reasonably set up development strategies and systems that will endure? Now that I hate to say it, we're on to the next crisis. And Chile is one of the biggest earthquakes in history. Much better prepared infrastructure. But what's going to happen to Haiti now that you've got Chile, or it's possible that it'll work together. People will remember Haiti because of Chile, but you get the idea. It's going to take both.
I'm going to ask you a theological question. So, Jesus tells the rich guy, "Go sell your stuff and follow me," or something along those lines. And so the question you have in this conversation here in the West End, or there's always a danger that comes up, like, how can we get about these issues and feel good about ourselves and make a difference while also keeping pretty much everything we have? And so I wanted to ask, I don't know if that's what you mean, but how do you distinguish between that sort of common approach in which to give some people something to do, a way to ease the complacency, but basically not fundamentally changing anything? And what you're talking about. What distinctions would you make?
So the rich young ruler went away sad because he had many possessions. If he only had a few, it would have been okay, but he had many, so it was a real bummer that Jesus said, this is the guy who's pushing Jesus, so that's the lawyer that leads into the Good Samaritan book, saying, "What shall I do to inherit eternal life? I'd follow all the law, so give me the advanced step." So Jesus says, "I'll give you the advanced step. Give me all your stuff." I think, like a number of the stories, it's a strong suggestion, like the justice discussion. That is the ideal, that we would be willing to share to the point of full community, of full equality. But I don't, because of the view of human nature that I think is a realistic one, I know that we're not going to do that. But how do we live between the tension of being totally comfortable and going away, kind of avoiding taking those lessons literally, and giving away all of there's a whole set of things I'm trying to get at. One is we can't do it by ourselves. We need to work on this in communities of accountability, communities that work on these issues, that find a passion for one issue and work specifically on it, so we can make a difference in Malawi. Or in Highland Park, as the university's done, commit to one area through building and so forth, with specific actions that are tangible and noticeable, and that resonate hopefully further beyond. But I think there's a certain discomfort as well that if we take this conversation seriously, we will be living differently. We'll not just be grateful that we're not in Haiti, as Anderson Cooper one day started his broadcast to say. Wherever you are today, hug someone around you and thank God that you're not in Haiti. Well, that's one response of gratitude, but I don't think it's enough. It's not what we need. But it's going to be a long-term strategy. It requires changing our generosity towards the poor in Richmond and in the U.S. and reaching out globally. So I don't have an easy answer for you, Thad, but I appreciate the question. And it's the tension, not just that I live in, but that we all live in, is we are so privileged in every way, not just in the Richmond level, but at the national and global level, too.
I'm going to take just one more question.
Doug, for many of us, one of our closest communities is our church, our parish. And stewardship is always at the top of there, etc. And we may often allow our church or our parish to be our agent in the good that's done in the world. I think you're speaking a much more personal connection than that, and something I want to translate very personally what each of our transactions is. What are your perspectives kind of working through a parish, a church, towards stewardship, towards a more global social justice? Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I'm trying to lay out a multifaceted approach that has to do with literally checking our checkbooks, our bank accounts, thinking about our own personal spending and giving habits, but then working through all the communities of which we're a part. I think this has to do with how we would vote on issues, how we would think about the state budget and the cuts, what's on the table this week are the cuts to education and health and so forth. I think the church in its various forms is one of the most vital, real, tangible human communities that we have. In some communities, the church is the only viable form of social capital that is working. But there's also a lot of glorification or romanticization of what churches are. And so, which church are you talking about? You're talking about specific people in a parish. I think that's the way to go. But then those leverage to the diocese or to the presbytery, to the General Assembly, and so on. Those are important levers, both for direct aid and for policy. In the Presbyterian Church, one of the challenges is that we have these really interesting, provocative, engaging national reports on what our policy should be towards higher education, towards poverty, towards gender equality. So no one reads them. I got a whole set of them on glossy, beautiful paper the other day. I don't know what list I'm on, but somebody spent $10 or $12 to get them to me when they could have been sent on a link email. So if somebody's spending a lot of money out of Louisville to get documents that aren't really a part of real conversations in the community. So I mentioned the church youth group trip I took as a high school, and I've gone on a number since then. But I've also written critically about what those kinds of trips achieve and what they don't achieve. They open up conversations, but they also can be done efficiently or inefficiently. They can be done condescendingly or respectfully, and so forth. But creating those links across the world, across the city, are valuable, and they are tangible, and to that extent, they open up other conversations and other work.
Hopefully this opened up conversations that we'll have with Doug on a continuing basis, perhaps with all of you one-on-one. If anybody would like to join us for lunch, meet in the back. We'll go over to the dining hall. Doug is also going to be over here to the back left to sign some books if you'd like to purchase a book. Thank you all for coming, and Doug, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.